Okay, everybody. Welcome to another live stream roundtable discussion coming to you live from our homes. I'm Nick from Sigma, and joining me today is a trio of photographic luminaries who will be talking about this. This is the Sigma 85mm F1.4 DG DN Art lens. It is a great new lens to be sure, but before we get into the weeds on this, let's first welcome our guests. First, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we have Sigma Ambassador Meg Loeks, who actually may have been the very first person in the entire country to shoot with this lens. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Thank you for joining us. And Meg's work almost always involves her adorable children in these charming environments. So get ready out there for some cuteness. And also on the stream is fellow Sigma ambassador Anabel DFlux, joining us from the Los Angeles area. So thank you for joining us, Anabel.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this lens.
And Annabelle has been putting this lens to good use shooting a variety of animal photos, so that will be also fun to check out. And of course, what live stream would be complete without a Sigma technical representative to help us learn more about the gear? Mike Hill is live from Las Vegas. Hey, Mike.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here on the Facebook live stream with you guys.
And by the way, while we are doing our live stream, we are definitely open to questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments and we'll try to address them as the live stream goes along. So today, of course, we are discussing the new Sigma 85mm f1.4 DG DN Art lens. This is available now for Sony E-mount and L-mount cameras. This lens is completely redesigned exclusively for mirrorless cameras, and it maintains the optical quality of the DG HSM version while also being a whole lot smaller and lighter with more practical features. So let's get the most obvious thing out of the way. When you guys took this thing out of the box, what did you think of it? Meg, why don't you kick us off with your impressions?
Well, when I opened up the box, the first thing I noticed was just how small it was. And it's comparable, I would say, to like the 35 art in size, and that kind of blew me away. And I'm glad that it's small. I mean, it should be small, right, on the Sony, because one of the things I love about my Sony mirrorless is that it's light and small. So I was glad to see that. And then the other thing that I noticed right away, and I love, is the manual aperture ring that you can change. I use that all the time. I love it. And it's really, really handy. So that was the second thing I noticed.
That manual aperture ring is a feature that a lot of people may not have asked for, not knowing that it was something that they could really enjoy. But there's having that tactile feeling of being able to change your aperture on the lens. It's a completely different experience than doing it with a command dial. So it's nice to hear that you enjoyed that, even though some of us, like myself, would probably just stick with the command dial. But it's a feature worth having and really interesting. Annabelle, when you first got your hands on this lens, what did you think? I mean, there's the obvious thing that it's just so darn small, right?
Yeah, and as an animal photographer, that is a really big deal for me. There's a reason that I started using the Sony mirrorless cameras as much as I do, because when you're photographing animals, you're constantly moving and you're following them around and you're changing positions consistently. So having something that is lightweight, that stops breaking my back, because the amount of back problems I have from very heavy equipment is numerable. And this helps tremendously. I mean, I don't feel the fatigue when I use this lens, especially paired with that camera, because altogether it is so ridiculously lightweight. And I mean, I can go straight on the ground on my stomach to photograph and quickly jump up into a different vantage point. So that was the primary thing that took me, as well as, of course, as Meg pointed out, the aperture ring also makes it incredibly helpful. No more accidental switching of buttons on my actual camera body when I can just turn that ring and know that it's going to stay at that consistent aperture the whole time.
And then one of the other features that it has, if you want to shoot at a specific aperture, Annabelle, for example, you almost always shoot wide open when I look at a lot of your work. Having the ability to lock it in place means that you will always be at 1.4 or 1.8 or 2.8 or whatever it is, so that you don't change your exposure or your depth of field as you're working. And then you both mentioned the size of the lens. I personally have been shooting with the 85mm DG HSM for years on my Sony mirrorless camera. And yeah, it did seem like a bit of a mismatch. Here's that one, and here's the new one. This is a 60% size difference. I'm not sure about the weight, but as far as the actual size dimensions of the lens go, it is such a huge difference. And while I haven't been able to part with this yet, just because it has a special place in my heart, this might be, I might be trading it in for the new version very shortly. So, Mike, how did they do this? How did the engineers in Japan actually manage to make this lens into this?
Well, that is pretty interesting. I was going to touch one thing too, is that this is the first still lens that has the click button on the side that can turn off that aperture ring clicking.
Yes.
So that's the first stills lens that will allow that for the filmers that want that silent turn on the aperture ring. It is 1.39 pounds, that lens. It's 1.1 pounds lighter than the larger one that Nick held up. How did they make it smaller? I read some interesting things. First, it has a stepping motor that allows it to not have this larger motor, but a series of motors. It utilizes some of the aberration correction that happens in the camera, so they can focus on the optics part on the lens and keep it smaller. And I read an interesting thing called, they have a team at Sigma called the Ghostbusters team, where they take a lens, this lens particular, and they do something called ray trace simulation, in which they take hundreds of photos, like through a computer modeling at different angles of light. And then they look at that light and see what kind of coma or flare it creates or ghosting. They go back, readjust that again. And then when they make a prototype, they'll do that, say 300 shots at a time, and make adjustments to constantly be reducing that flare. So it's pretty interesting that we have a team called the Ghostbusters in Sigma, Japan, just for ghosting and flare.
And I think being able to reduce ghosting and flare is really important on a portrait lens like this, because how often are wedding photographers shooting with that sun right in front of them? You know, you want to backlight your subject, get that amazing feel behind them, and being able to reduce those annoying flares and ghosts that you can't get rid of in post is really important. So kudos to the optical engineers over in Japan to make this lens so effective optically. So you mentioned we've already talked about the aperture ring, the declicking, the lock switch. There's also your normal AF, MF switch over here for switching from autofocus to manual focus. And then we have an AFL button, which Mike, I believe is programmable as well, right?
Yes, you can use it as a regular autofocus lock in the field, which is nice. When I was shooting at 1.4, you can lock it in and hold it there. But with the Sony camera, I think there are 20-something individual settings you can do in body to change that to something else. Although AFL works pretty well. I haven't seen, I'd be curious in the chat to see what people might be using that for, because there are a lot of options.
All right, so early on when we first got this lens, we had a couple copies at the office, and we sent two of them out, one of them to Meg, one of them to Annabelle, and they both were able to spend some time with the lens. And I'm going to bring up some of their images so we can talk about them and discuss exactly what it is that they used this lens for, and what they were able to accomplish with it technically. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going to look at one of Meg's images first. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
All right. So this is Meg's daughter, Scout, and she is sitting on looks like a rusty staircase. That's a bit precarious. And I hope none of that is poison ivy, but she is just so adorable, as she always is. Meg, this was the first image that I saw that you had taken when you first received this lens. So just a couple days prior to launch. What were you doing here? What settings were you shooting at? And what did you think about when you first began shooting with this lens?
So I first of all was just driving through town and just randomly saw this spot, and I've driven by this area hundreds of times and somehow never noticed the yellow building and this amazing green vine growing up these stairs. And I happened to have my camera lens with me, and also a dress for my daughter that matched the building. I had it all in my car. So I pulled over immediately and I got this shot. I almost always shoot wide open when I'm outside. So I know I had my aperture at least at 1.4, maybe 1.6. And
Yep,
I shot this.
we are at 1.4.
Was
Yep.
it 1.4? One of the things I noticed right away is how tack sharp it is at 1.4. I always like to shoot wide open and see how sharp it's going to be. And that really impressed me with this lens, that her face was incredibly sharp. I'm photographing my family. So all the subjects that you're going to see here, they're my children, my 4 children. And they range in ages, but she's a toddler, so she's constantly moving and she's pretty fast. So it's important for me to obviously have a lens that's going to be really fast and really sharp.
And you can see the sharpness here in this image. And I don't even know how far in we are on the image. That's zoomed in a pretty decent amount.
Right.
And yeah, obviously the sharpness is there. Every hair on her head is nice and sharp.
Yeah. And I like to shoot wide open, especially outside, because I like separating my subject from the background. I like having that dreamy feel and look to my images. And so that's why I'm often pushing my aperture to 1.4 or as wide as it can be, like I did here in this shot.
This one is another one that you sent to us very early on, and I was so impressed with the way that you were able to capture Scout's eyes through a screen, and also incorporate a lot of your images. In fact, I would say most of them are probably what you would consider environmental portraits, where your subject is a relatively small part of the frame, and it incorporates so much more into it in order to tell a story. And the way that she is framed in this image, and then technically speaking, the way her eyes are in perfect focus. And I can only imagine how difficult this might be with someone who's moving around left and right and back and forth. This is just an outstanding shot. And when I first saw this, I'm like, how did she do that?
Thank you. Yeah, I was like, I'm gonna challenge this lens. I wanted to see what it could do. I do like to shoot through like our windows and our doors, our screens, all of that. So I wanted to see how good it would operate shooting through the screen door. Obviously, she's really close to the screen door too. So I want to make sure that she was, very, very close to that screen so that I could grab focus easier. But she's moving around again. She's a toddler. She wasn't completely holding still for me. And as you could see, her eyes were just incredibly sharp. So I just love this lens for portraiture. But then also, like, as you mentioned, environmental portraiture is typically what I'm drawn to, especially with my children. I do like to capture a lot of the environment and surroundings. And that's what I did here with that 85.
Now, when we talk about environmental portraiture, most people would start to think this is a job for a wide angle lens because you want to bring in as much of the background as possible. But one of the things that makes your images unique is that you typically shoot at a longer focal length, whether it's an 85 here or a 105 or a 135. What is it about using a longer focal length that you think makes your images really stand out from the crowd?
Well, one of the reasons I like to use a longer focal length is I do like to just give my children some space. And so I like to kind of let them see, do their own thing and see what they're going to do. So I like to give them that space so that I'm not too heavily involved in what they're doing. The one reason that I really love the 85 length is because I do feel like I could be at a safe distance from my children. It still capture, a lot of the environment around them. But the reason I like these longer lenses, so I pull back quite a bit and still try to capture a lot of the environment, whether it's inside or outside. But I love these longer lenses because they do give my images a very dreamy feel, especially when I'm shooting wide open at like 1.4, which I often do. And I want to have that separation, from my subject in the background, and kind of isolate my subject and make them pop, make them stand out. So that's another reason I really gravitate towards longer lenses.
And as we can see in the areas where where it's in focus, nice and sharp, at a longer focal length, still shooting wide open, you get enough depth of field where you can get her entire face. Really just wonderful work, something that we've become accustomed to, but for some reason never we never stop being surprised by how wonderful some of your images are, Meg. All right, I'm going to switch over to some of Anabel's work. Now, Anabel, you do portraiture as well, and you also specialize in music photography, which of course is not really happening at the moment since there's no concerts going on and people are not really gathering together in groups, hopefully. So you've done a lot more work with animals lately, and one of your first shoots was with a horse. I hope there's not some kind of technical term for this horse that I'm missing out, but I believe it was a young mare.
Yes,
And
an Arabian mare.
I'm going to share that one just a second once I figure out how to do it. I'm still not used to this Zoom thing. It's only been 5 months. There we go.
There we go.
So as I had mentioned before, you do shoot wide open on most of your images, and this one shows off the bokeh of the 85mm DG DN Art quite nicely. And then every last hair on this horse's mane and coat is rendered in perfect detail. So tell us a little bit more about this shoot and how the lens worked for you.
So I saw this shoot as a perfect opportunity to test out this lens because we drove about 3 hours outside of Los Angeles into a completely empty equestrian field, which gave me a lot of room to have that kind of depth and have everything that is behind the focus line blur away beautifully into a bokeh. And by the time that I got there, it had already become the golden hour, which was another really dreamlike time of day to shoot. And again, the reason that I really, really love this lens is it's really, really compact size because it gave me the opportunity to actually consistently run back and forth and kind of follow the horse throughout its movement, to be able to capture that kind of perfect rendition where the mane is flowing and the face is nicely in focus and you kind of get that action moment there.
And then when you're in that dusty field, you get all these little bits of dander and plant material flying around. It's actually pretty cool how you were able to take what is typically seen as a portrait lens and utilize it for what is kind of a fast-moving scenario, right? I mean, you were able, obviously, with a wide aperture, and I guess this would be sort of late afternoon lighting conditions, but certainly fast enough to get everything at a fast shutter speed, right?
Absolutely. I mean, all of my equipment, whether it's meant for action or not, I push to shoot action anyways, because when I work with animals, a lot of the time, even when you tell them to stand.
Oop, I think we lost Anabel.
Still, or you tell them to sit down, it's still an animal. Can we hear me?
Yeah, we just lost you for a second. So I would say about your last 10 seconds, we probably missed, but maybe you can backtrack a little bit.
Absolutely. So every lens that I use with animals, I am going to push to be an action lens anyways, because no matter how much you tell an animal to sit and stay, they're still animals at the end of the day, and they could get up and start moving. And that sometimes makes the most creative personality shots. So I'm always pushing them to do that. Yes. There's another one. This horse was having the best time of her life. Just being asked to just keep trotting around the field.
Just run around in this beautiful sun-kissed field of grass. Don't mind us.
Nope.
Yep. And again, because you were able to shoot at a nice quick shutter, look at the whiskers.
Oh, I love whiskers.
Is that a technical term for horses? I don't know, but
Look at that bling.
Yeah, horse has more bling than I do, which is not much. I've just got my Timex.
Oh,
But another wonderful shot, basically the same conditions, but you were able to capture a little bit more motion here and also a little bit more of the environment. And we'll continue on. This is another one that I really loved. The eyeball of this horse is just so very sharp. I can see somebody in the eyeball. That's not you, but I would imagine that was the horse's owner, yeah?
yep.
And you're pairing this lens with a Sony A7R, I believe, Mark IV.
4. Yeah.
So that has a ton of resolution. I believe it's somewhere in the 60 megapixel range. So
Yes.
how is this lens, in your opinion, working to render that an image on that entire that huge image sensor, that all of that detail?
I mean, this is honestly one of the absolute sharpest lenses I had ever used. Because I think as photographers, we do kind of get into a really terrible habit of sharpening our images in post a little bit, but these images are not sharpened
Guilty.
in
Yep.
post at all. I mean, this is the way that the lens renders everything. And when you pair it with a 60, I believe it's 61 officially megapixel camera, you can see every single itty bitty detail, and also allows you to crop in quite a bit and
Mhm.
still be able to have that beautiful, beautiful quality.
Absolutely. So, Mike, I'm going to switch over to a couple of your images. The first one I'm going to go to was not necessarily something you'd think of to show off the capabilities of a portrait lens, but I was still very impressed by the way that it rendered the background here. So if you're looking for a portrait lens that yields beautiful bokeh, this is probably going to be a great option for you. And I'm just going to bring up this nice stalk of grass here that you shot a few weeks ago. And you can see that this image shot at 1.6 not only keeps the majority of this stalk of grass here in focus and beautifully sharp, but also completely blows away the entire background here. And you can see these nice circular highlights in the background. Mike, this is representative of what the 85mm DG DN Art can do.
Yeah, definitely. And I learned recently too that with the 11 rounded blade aperture, that you get a more beautiful circular bokeh. Then that's what this lens has on the 85 1.4 lens. So yeah, this was just kind of to show off those little feathery details on that.
And then we've got a couple other portraits that you had shot as well. And this is a typical type of portrait environment. Looks like it's in studio with a background and possibly a little bit of artificial lighting here, but a perfect example of the type of rendering that the 85mm DGDN Art is capable of. So perfect focus on the eyeball, every last eyelash, all of the little capillaries in
Yeah.
focus. But also the fall off is nice and soft and gradual and exactly what you want out of an 85mm lens.
Yeah, this is my friend Myron, who's a 8x10 portrait artist. He does the wet plate printing, and he has a very small studio, and this is just with natural light.
Like
This is one of those cases where I'm someone who, before I started at Sigma, bought that 35 Sigma and bolted it to my camera back when it was DSLR, and would walk around mainly because it was the smallest prime lens I could put on a DSLR and cruise around with. And like what you were saying with Meg, with environmental portraiture, 35 just sort of works for that. But what's beautiful about an 85 is the longer the lens, the more compression you get on the background. This isn't the best example of it because it's a tight space, but it made me think when you're talking to Meg about how you could back up more with longer lenses, get less distortion, more compression. And the reason I wouldn't take an 85 out before, and I do now, is kind of what you said. It's a large lens. You feel like it's for the studio. Now I grab the 85 like it's a 35 because the size is almost the same, plus on the mirrorless. and it completely changes your style and method of shooting. So it is one of those lenses where you, as a tech rep, we have all the lenses, and you have your favorites, but then every so often something comes, it's just wow. And with the 85, that's what it is. And it starts with the way it feels in hand, and then you check the images, and it's tack sharp. And this is just on the fly. This isn't some sit down thing. It's just having coffee. Hey, can I take a few pics?
That
So
is
it's
a
great to
very
just have
detailed
with you.
beard right there.
Yeah. But yeah, it's beautiful for that. It kind of just changes. If you've had a 35 bolted on forever like me, it makes you kind of think differently about your portrait work and your photography in general. How can I, again, like Meg, work with a longer lens and do environmental stuff a little differently, you know, back up a little bit more, give some space, especially now where space is maybe a little more needed. Some shooters like to work very close. I'm a little softer talker. If you want to be in your spot, and some people like to get way back, and it also depends on your subject too, how comfortable they are with you. You might have a 14-24 up close and they're like, but they're more comfortable when you got a 70-200, you're actually closer, you're zooming in on them. But it's also the expressions that you might evoke from someone who's more or less comfortable.
Yep, and a mid-telephoto prime like this, I guess normally you would, most people would think of, you would use it in a special use case. You know, you're set on taking portraits today, and you're going to have a special setup. Your subject knows what it is that they expect from you. But now, because the lens is so compact, this is almost transitioning this into an everyday lens. And I think the more people have this affixed to their camera, the more they're going to see prime lenses as a really a go-to way to get images in almost any situation. And Meg, I saw a piece that you had written. I don't know if it's out yet, but it was basically the gist of it was that the 85 is a go-to portraiture lens, and I would imagine this comes in handy in many different situations. And one thing that you are able to do that I think is really important for photographers to understand and to practice is to zoom with their feet, as the expression goes. Learn how to use a prime lens and make it work in lots of different situations. And quite frankly, this is something that you can pop onto your camera all the time and bring it with you, and they will be able to make use of it in almost any situation, something that you've become, basically a master of, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I always tell people that I get the question a lot, like what would be your go-to lens? And since I shoot with all prime lenses, I always tell people I would grab two, and I would grab the 35 and I would grab the 85 because they are both great everyday lenses. They're going to work in almost every situation. And with the 85, it's just such a wonderful everyday telephoto lens, just because not only are you getting that, beautiful bokeh, that compression behind your subject, especially if you're shooting, wide open. And then of course, proximity does play a role, how close you are to your subject, but you're getting all of that. But then, like I said, you don't have to back up, like 100 feet to photograph your subject. You could be at a safe distance, especially when it's really important that you need to be. And since I'm photographing my children and my daughter, especially, she's a toddler, she's really little, I do sometimes need to be close to her, but I still want that gorgeous compression, all of that. So the 85 works great in these instances because I don't have to stand that far away from her if I need to be close. So that's one of the reasons I absolutely love this lens.
I think one of the other advantages about it is that because it's a normal to mid telephoto range, that you can be up close, you can be far away. Either way, you're not going to have any kind of weird distortion in your images. You're always going to get a natural look that really is appealing to the eye that we're all used to as far as portraits go. Real quick, Meg, we have a question here, and you may have touched on this a little bit, but Scott says he's just getting into children's portraits. What would be the one thing you'd recommend keeping in mind when shooting with a prime lens? And I guess that is you know, regardless of what focal length it is, working with children and being able to move with them is a skill that not all of us possess.
I think, yeah, I think it's important. One of the things I teach, and I say quite often, is to unglue your feet. So I think sometimes we get caught up in just like not moving and taking the same shot over and over and over again.
Right.
And so it's, even for me, like constantly reminding myself to unglue my feet. I tend to be one of those people that gravitates towards standing back away from my subject, away from my children, to photograph them and capture a lot of the environment. I have to remind myself to get in close and to capture some details and all of that. So that's one thing I recommend when shooting with a prime lens, is to, you know, remind yourself, unglue your feet, but take your safe shot first, and then move around, change your perspectives to get different angles, because you might surprise yourself that, you know, you took your first shot that you intended, but then maybe your second or your third shot you love even more because you moved around.
I'm going to pull up a couple more images, but before I do, Annabelle, I think the same thing is applicable when you're talking about shooting animals, right? Being able to keep up with them using a prime lens is difficult. One of the advantages of shooting on a Sony system is that you have eye autofocus detection, and that applies not only to fast-moving kids, but to fast-moving animals as well. How did you find that the autofocus system worked for you, and did it work just as well on your human subjects as it did on your animal subjects?
Absolutely. I mean, it locked on focus really, really fast. And we are a little spoiled with these autofocus systems versus once
True.
upon a time, which we were struggling a little bit more, but it was really, really fast and it held on throughout the entire range of motion. I always switch my camera over to continuous focus so it locks onto a moving subject, even if they're not moving, because again, animals, they're not very predictable. Even when you say it's the most well-trained creature on the planet, they might still get up and move. And with the continuous autofocus, locks on the eyes, holds that focus throughout the entire range of motion. And having that kind of 85mm range to me is like the perfect focal length, because again, you are far enough away to not really influence what's happening as much, but still a close enough distance to be able to move around or catch the pet if you need to.
Mike, as we're talking about autofocus here, you mentioned earlier in the live stream that it has a different different autofocus motor. The new 85 has a stepping motor as opposed to the hypersonic motor that was in the older version of the lens. Apart from, as you mentioned, being able to reduce the size of the lens overall, what other advantages does the stepping motor offer for this lens over the old one?
Well, in situations like Annabelle was talking about, where you're waiting for that animal to move and there's these micro adjustments that might happen as he's about to bolt. With the hypersonic motor, it's a larger turn. So with micro adjustments, it can happen quicker with the stepping motor. So that's one of the great things about it. And also mainly that it reduces the size of it. I thought it was worth mentioning that this particular lens of the designers that did this 85 were the same designers. Even there's a special team that worked on this one. They're the same ones that did the 18-35 1.8, which is the only 1.8 that's been made for the crop sensor. The 14-24 DG DN, which was won wide angle zoom of the year twice in a row for the Lucy Awards, as well as the 35 and the 50. The 50 was arguably the 35 put us on the map for SGV, Sigma Global Vision, and then the 50 was rated forever as one of the sharpest 50s, and this 85 prior to this was also the sharpest 85 made, and this new 85 is considered to be even sharper than that 85, even with the smaller size. So this is really a great feat as a new lens.
I'm going to share another couple of Meg's photos here so we can get a little bit more variety. This is a shot of her son perched on the edge of a cliff here with a little walking stick. I guess you always have a yellow shirt packed along with you so that they can stand out from the background. That's a good tip, pro tip, everybody. But this is a wonderful shot that shows the ability of the lens to create that compression and blur out the background, even when the background itself is so expansive.
Yeah, yeah, and this was it's one of those kind of like optical illusions. He really isn't on a cliff.
Yes, I imagine.
I get that every now and then. We're like, oh, isn't that really dangerous? It's actually, you can kind of see those are like bushes right in front of them. So there's they're not trees. But it looks like it just because of my low perspective. So I got down really low to the ground here. And again, this is, I think, shot wide open or close to it. Again, helping to separate him from the background. Yeah, so 1.6.
Yep.
And isolate him. And obviously he pops too because of the color of his shirt. But you can see how tack sharp this is. And again, proximity plays a role too. The farther back I am, the wider my focal plane is going to be. And I'm standing quite a ways from him. But that's one of the things I love about this lens is that, I could shoot wide open and still get that beautiful, creamy bokeh compression, standing, further distance from my subject. I wouldn't get that with like the 35. So there's definitely a difference between, the two lenses where you're going to get a more dreamy feel with the 85.
Yes, absolutely. Now, this next image is something that really illustrates your ability to tell stories with your images. And this was also shot at 1.6. Get that perfect dreamy background. Again, that your porch seems to be a new favorite spot for some of these images. And I love this scene. Shucking corn was always one of my jobs as a youngster. And although I never took this step that Scout is taking here. that is just adorable.
I've taken the shot once before, actually, when my son pictured here was her age. And so my work kind of centers around my family life and nostalgia. And so I tend to gravitate towards anything that's really nostalgic to me, which this is, because I used to do the same thing, Chuck. Corn on the porch steps with my dad. So we do the same thing here. And so I wanted to photograph that. So this is just at our home, but wanted to capture both of my children here, doing just that on our front porch. And you could see my daughter, especially, she's really, really sharp. And this is shot almost wide open.
She is having the time of her life.
Yeah, she's just, she's she's a handful. And like I said, this is another reason why it's so important for me to have a lens that's really fast. Just because, like animals, children are very unpredictable and don't know what's going to happen, what she's going to do. She's going to get up and she's just going to run off. And so that's one of the other reasons I love this lens, is that it's so incredibly fast.
And speaking of children and animals, here's a shot that's close to my heart as a fellow chicken keeper. Here is Scout heading off with an old bucket. And again, I love the fact that I guess you would consider this a prop. I don't know if this is the bucket that you use on a daily basis, but you've got a nice old antique tin pail here, and the chickens are ready for a treat. And I just love this scene. It is just, it really epitomizes the storytelling aspect and what this lens can do for you in that respect.
Thank you. Yeah, that pail is actually, usually I try to include things that have sentimental value. And so our property, there's an old homestead on our property. And so that bucket is from the old homestead on our property. So it was just something that we found. We found a lot of things like old wagon wheels here and stuff like that too. So, and she does use that. We put chicken feed in it, and this is like one of her favorite things to do. So I always encourage people when they're photographing children, especially, to give them something to do. That'll give you a ton of shots and opportunities to shoot different things. And that's what I like to do with my kids, is just give them something to do, especially that they love to do. And then I get out my camera and photograph them.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a shot of one of your kids looking at the camera and smiling, which I must admit is the majority of my portfolio when it comes to my children. But I think that's what makes your images so unique and so special. So that's great advice for people who are not only taking images of their own children, but if they do this for a living.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to move on to some more of Annabelle's shots. We've got our horse shoot, and now we have some images with our canine friends, or if I've got the term correct, our lupine friends.
Yes.
Do I get that right? Okay.
You did. You did.
I'm gonna start with the standard dogs first, though. Here we have a Roddy taking a break in the dirt, and again with the help of the Sony IAF for animals, you've got nice sharp focus on their eyes, not his nose, which is something that I have always had difficulty with. Because I guess maybe because the noses are usually wet and they have a little bit of contrastiness to them. That's the thing that the camera used to pick up, but not so anymore. And the lens renders everything in beautiful detail. And lucky for the photographer here, Annabelle, he was perfectly content to just lie nice and still for you.
He was. Funny enough, this is actually a trick his owner trained him to do. It's called head down, which as a photographer, I always feel spoiled whenever pet owners come to me with fun tricks like this.
With actual trained animals.
Yeah, oh, I mean, I love them all, but when they do a cute little trick like this, it's amazing. And I find that the benefit of the 85 millimeters that I was able to be far enough away so that the dog was only focusing on the commands of his owner rather than being distracted by me being right in his face. Because I used to use the 35 for shots like this and find that the animals do get a little distracted because suddenly there's something in their face versus here where there was a distance for them to not feel like I'm invading their area as much.
And here we have a little, I believe this would be a Chihuahua.
Yep.
Yep, getting his stretch on.
I believe he's about 13.
Wow. Well, I guess at that age, you got to stretch every now and then. But this is another example of how you can just completely eliminate a busy background. And with this lens, you still get those nice circular highlights all throughout, nice and soft. And of course, once you get in on that little doggy's face, you can see how sharp it is, and you can see again some of the little bits of dust flying off his head as he gets around in the dirt.
Absolutely, and that depth of field really is so lovely because this was just shot in a dirt lot, so it makes it look very dreamy versus what it actually looks like.
I think one thing I always like to do, which I don't do myself enough, is to get a behind the scenes shot of what the setting actually is, and what you with your skill as a photographer and what your equipment can combine to create. And like you said, if this was in just some random dirt lot, you've really done a nice job here making it look like something special. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna head out into the woods or in that burnt field you mentioned before. Yeah. And this is Phelan, I believe.
Yes, he is a wolf dog.
So that is a crossbreed, a half wolf, half dog, or just a...
Yeah, he's about 77% wolf, according to the DNA test.
Okay. So you definitely want to keep a little bit of distance between you and an animal like this, just in case, right?
I mean, he is really beautifully socialized and he knows me very well, so we can come right up. But I do like the distance because the compression of this lens creates makes his proportions look really, really beautiful. Plus, everything kind of blurring out in the background really isolates him. This is kind of the quote unquote Halloween look. Yeah. So we wanted him to look a little bit more ominous than he actually does. He's really goofy, I swear.
Another great example is this shot here. This is something you don't want to see if you are camping and you're lying on the ground. A wolf, I wouldn't know the difference between a wolf and a wolf dog, licking his chops on his way towards you. So another great example of the 85mm DG DN in action.
Thank you.
All right, let me just real quickly check the stream here and see if we have any questions. All right, so Mohammed says that he is a fashion photographer specializing in street fashion. So let's see, I generally use a 24 to 105 millimeter. I generally try to get a full length medium and a portrait. How would the 85 millimeter prime work in this situation? So uh, my understanding here is that an 85 millimeter at a wide open aperture would work very well in a city setting, simply because if you want to have that environment around you, but you also want to remove the distracting details, something like this with lots of compression as well as a wide open aperture would work very well for that situation, right, Mike?
Yeah, and it's an advantage over the 24-105, which is an f4, and you have an 85-1.4 that's tack sharp at 1.4. So definitely the bokeh would be, you can pretty much achieve everything with applying the philosophy of using your feet as a zoom, like you were talking earlier, and you have no distortion, because at 24, you're going to have a lot more distortion than you would from backing up with an 85.
Right, and with fashion, with portraits, when you're working with models, distortion at the wide end is probably something you want to avoid at all costs.
And I've had situations like that, similar to him, where you're at 24 and you say you want to do a full body lifestyle shot or something.
Hmm.
What happens is the foot or the hand, the foot that might be on the edge of that frame becomes really gigantic. Versus if you were to back it up with an 85, it would eliminate that, and that would be huge.
Right. Now, there's something to be said, of course, if that's the creative look you're going for, but if you want to have no distortion and you want to be able to have not only the sharpness, but the shallow depth of field, that sort of dreamy quality in any setting, an 85 is a great choice. Just be careful if you're in the city and you need to cross the street. Don't get too wrapped up in your lens and your subject. Use the crosswalk. Probably a good idea. Speaking of settings, Annabelle, you were out in a dusty, burnt out field. Meg, you were, out with the chickens, and as we know, the weather can get pretty hairy up there in Upper Michigan. This lens is completely weather sealed. All of the new DG DN Art lenses are completely weather sealed, and that's not just the mount. It doesn't have, a minimal amount of weather sealing. These are dust and splash proof. So does that give you an additional sense of peace of mind when you're out there working? And is this something that you expect in a lens like this? Either one of you can jump in, sure.
Well, I would say that being in that burnt out field, because it was burned recently, fortunately, luckily no casualties or anything. It was very contained and they were able to put it out very quickly. But because of that, the ash was still laying on the top, which means that every step brought up a whole cloud of ash and dust and all of that. And knowing that this lens is so well weather sealed, I was able to lay down on my stomach right on the ground and not be terribly worried about all of that entering all the really sensitive components of that lens. So it gave me a lot of freedom to just get right down there and get the shot that I need.
Right. And then Meg, like if this is one of your go-to lenses, something that you have attached to your camera all the time, you want it to be there for you and to perform when those special moments arrive and they just pop up out of nowhere. You want to be ready and make sure that your lens is ready, right?
Right. Well, and I do work in inclement weather a lot here, and I don't protect my gear very often. I know that I should, but I often am just try to be very, very quick, and I often have to be quick because I'm working with a toddler who is only going to put up with me for about 1 to 2 minutes. So I'm shooting out in the snow. I'm shooting sometimes even in the rain, as long as it's light enough, and I don't always protect my gear, so it's important for me to have, that kind of weather seal.
Mike, we do have a question here, and this is a question that I think a lot of people need to have answered. You had mentioned earlier on in the stream that to make this lens as small as it is, it relies a little bit on digital magic, right? We need to rely on lens corrections that are applied within the camera body. So the question here from Gerald is, this lens depends on the camera body for distortion correction. Does it fix the raw files as well, or do we need to fix it in post? How much is it visible for a normal portrait photo? Now, I'll say personally in my own use, there are not Lightroom profiles available for this lens yet. So when I shot in RAW, I did do a little bit of post-processing, but it wasn't anything, outlandish as far as portraits are concerned. So maybe you can fill us in a little bit on that.
Well, you have to really drill down with some zooming in to really find first the distortion that might exist on the slightest level in an 85, because there's very little. In Lightroom, yes, you wouldn't need a lens profile to correct anything in there. You could still do it with distortion correction in Lightroom, or what most people would deploy would be any distortion correction within the Sony system or within a FP body system. But again, you would have to be really seeking out any distortion at an 85 lens. We don't have to do, we put one aspherical lens element in there, which it's not necessary to have too many in there, like something with the 14mm 1.8, where it has to stay aspherical, asymmetrical, aspherical rectilinear, not asymmetrical. And so with this, there's very little adjustment needed. It's just purely to make it a little bit smaller. To correct everything optically for every possible scenario on the DSLR one, that is what made it so large.
Right.
So it is really that distortion part.
So a small trade-off, basically, you turn on lens correction in your camera body if you're shooting with JPEGs, and until there's a widely available profile in Lightroom, you just make a little tweak on your raw files, and that's pretty much it, right?
But I think it's worth saying here that I don't have that on in a Sony camera, and the images you saw of that portrait, and I don't know if either Meg or Annabelle have any correction happening. I haven't seen it to be necessary, but there's really nothing to correct. If you, out of the box, you don't even set anything on the camera, it's just, we're telling you the tiniest little details of how we arrive at a smaller lens. But really, it's, to my eye as a photographer and artist, I am really stretching to see some of the distortion they might be talking about. And they're really talking about corner to corner on the very, very edge when they're magnifying something super small.
Okay, good to know. Heather has a question on the stream. Annabelle, do you notice any difference in this lens between the speed of human eye autofocus and animal eye autofocus?
Nope. I mean, it locked on incredibly fast. I didn't even have to really adjust anything.
Yeah, and I think that's mostly a function of the Sony autofocus system. But as far as the autofocus of the lens is concerned, it should be equally quick no matter what species of animal you are photographing.
Absolutely.
So guys, I think that about wraps it up. We're almost at an hour here. I want to thank you all very much for your time. Meg, thank you so much for taking the time to share your images with us. Annabelle, you as well. Thank you so much. Mike, thank you for taking the time to answer our tough technical questions. I'm having difficulty today. It's been a long week. I do want to get one other thing out of the way. Really important. The price of this lens, it's $11.99, and that is for either Sony E mount or L mount cameras. And for a 85mm f1.4 lens with this kind of optical quality, as well as all the weather sealing and all the extra little features, the value of this lens is just, it's incredible. And I don't think we need to mention it, but it's about $600 apart from our closest competitor in this range. Go out there, take a look at all the reviews, see what this lens is all about. Tons of people are shooting with it already, including Meg, Annabelle, and some of our other ambassadors. You can see how sharp this lens is, the kind of bokeh quality that you get out of it. And then, of course, just the size of the lens just makes it's like, it's really hard to not get this lens if you are a serious portrait photographer who is shooting in an E-mount or L-mount system. So guys, anything else? Why don't we tell our viewers where they can find you? Meg, start with you. Let's how about some websites and Instagrams and whatnot?
Well, my website is megloeks.com. And you can find me on Instagram at Meg_NLO. And I post almost daily there. So I'm frequently sharing, and I often share my gear as well when I'm posting.
And Meg, you also are involved a lot in workshops and educational efforts as well. So maybe you can shed a little light on that too, so our viewers can follow along with you.
Yeah, so I teach, and I'm also a mentor through Click and Moms. And the upcoming workshop, online workshop that I have right now is called Mastering Manual Exposure. Starts Monday. There's just a few full participation seats left actually on that one. And we just cover everything about metering and exposure triangle and custom white balance. And then I have another class that's called Finding the Classic Beauty in Your Everyday. And that one starts next year in January. And that one is more of a creative class.
Excellent. So Annabelle, how about yourself? Where can everyone find you?
Well, I would say the best resource to find me would be on Instagram. I'm on Instagram as Anabel DFlux. It is ANABEL DFLUX. And that will take you around to my website and all the other socials that are connected.
So everybody follow Meg and Annabelle on social. And Mike, you thought you might get away without answering this question, but do we know when the Canon and Nikon versions will be available?
You try to get me fired on a Friday, I tell you, you're trying to hard questions. There's been no word on that actually. I hate to give you like a blanket answer like this, but currently there's no announcements.
Yeah, we will let you all know when we know. So unfortunately, we don't have a roadmap or anything like that. But if we develop those lenses, we will let you know. We're not keeping any secrets here at Sigma. So Mike, thank you as well for coming along and joining us. Meg, Annabelle, once again, thanks so much. And thank you all out there on Facebook for tagging along with us for the past hour. And hopefully you will check out the 85mm DG DN Art for yourselves. And once you actually get a chance to use it, see the results that you get out of it, it's something that's really hard to not purchase. So it's really literally the next thing on my shopping list. So again, once again, thank you all for joining us. And until next time, this is Nick, Meg, Annabelle, and Mike signing off.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, guys.